Hello, and you're listening to Your Majesty's Secret Podcast. I like my podcast shaken, not stirred. Only on the Four-Eyed Radio Network. If you'd like to check out more shows, go to foureyedradio.com.
This Four-Eyed Radio production is brought to you by America Joy Print Shop. All your printing needs taken care of in one convenient place. Visit americajoy.com for business cards, flyers, banners, decals, car wraps, and more. Visit americajoy.com.
Bond. James Bond.
Shaken, not stirred.
Utter one more syllable and I'll have you killed.
I thought Christmas only comes once a year.
For your eyes only, darling.
I never joke about my work, 007.
For England, James?
Come in, Univex. James Bond here.
Am I going to have a problem with you, Bond?
Allow me to introduce myself.
You're that secret agent! That English secret agent from England!
No, you're cleverer than you look.
Still better than looking cleverer than you are.
My God, what's Bond doing?
I think he's attempting re-entry, sir.
007 reporting for duty.
Hello, the name's Berkeley, Ziggy Berkeley, from Cinema on the Rocks. And with me is Eric Dewey from Socially Awkward Studios. And you are listening to Her Majesty's Secret Podcast, only on The Fern. This is where we discuss all things 007. And tonight we're going to take James Bond literally, as in literature. Because we're going to be discussing several of the novels written by people other than Ian Fleming for the James Bond universe.
The non-Flemish version of Bond.
Yes, the non-Flemish versions. Now, the thing about the James Bond literary universe is it doesn't work quite the same way as things like, say, the Star Trek novelizations, where it's basically glorified fanfic, or where it's something like the Star Wars universe, where you have authors who are interested in writing Star Wars novels, and then they're vetted to become part of canon and become part of an extended universe, but right. There's still lots of latitude and so on.
Well, yeah. And, well, the interesting thing with Star Wars novels specifically is there is actually only one novel that is officially canon as far as George Lucas's Star Wars universe, and that's Shadows of the Empire. All of the rest of them are all canon within the extended universe, but they are not considered canon by Lucas or Lucasfilm in the actual universe. So it's they've got like two whole worlds going on there.
But the extended universe does exist consistently, and that's a pretty rare thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Like you'll never find that in Star Trek.
Yeah, the Star Trek novels kind of go all over the place. Some of them are really good. I've read a ton of them, but trying to follow along with the universe, Star Wars definitely does it better when it comes to that extended universe continuity.
And in terms of authorizations and such, this is something that's closer to Star Wars, maybe even more so along the lines of Brian Herbert taking over for Frank Herbert based on his notes to do additional Dune works. Because what happened with Ian Fleming is that after his death, his estate still held publication rights for novels. And they decided to authorize certain writers to continue on in the same vein and write James Bond novels, but not a whole ton of them, like you see in things like, again, Star Trek, Star Wars, and just about every sci-fi fantasy franchise imaginable. But instead, they'd go to one author and say, hey, you didn't ask us, but would you like to write a James Bond novel? And that's basically how this process works. And it's
more like
very
an
different.
Invitation. It's more like a, hey, we like your stuff, so we would like you to consider writing for James Bond.
Yeah, it's something very different. I don't know of this model existing in any other major literary series at all. But it's intriguing. As far as the results, well, we'll be talking about that. There have been several different authors who have written novels. The first one after Ian Fleming was Kingsley Amis, who wrote a single book, Colonel Sun, which we will not be talking about because it has been... I have only seen copies of it. I've never been able to read it myself. And I don't think Eric has either.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's one of the ones that... I did manage to find a big pack of various James Bond ebooks, including those by Fleming and those by others. And I'm not sure if that was one that was included or not. I'll have to go through the list more thoroughly and to check on that. But it doesn't ring a bell in my head, which means it probably wasn't in the list that I was looking at.
The ones that people are going to be the most familiar with, I think, because it was the longest run by a consistent author, was basically during what, in film terms, I would consider the golden age of action, but in real life we call the 1980s and the early 1990s. Author John Garnder was approached to do a long string of James Bond novels. We'll be talking about one of those. And then after he decided to retire from writing those works, Raymond Benson, who had been very much an Ian Fleming antiquarian before that, American author, which was something that caused a bit of a stir, was approached to write some novels, and he did so for a while. And then after that, we got just one-offs by Sebastian Faulks, Devil May Care, Jeffery Deaver, Carte Blanche, which we'll be talking about, and most recently, William Boyd with Solo, which just came out this past October.
Yes.
So we'll be talking about some of those novels, and just a general discussion of, are they worthy, to quote Wayne English. But first of all, what do you think of the idea of, because we're so used to it with a series that you can kind of identify as corporate, where a big studio went behind it, but this is the family of a literary author saying, okay, you go for it.
Right.
What do you think? Do you like that approach?
I do, actually, because I think that you're going to get, in general, you're going to get more honesty from as far as an honest representation of what the character should be, because you're going to get the family, assuming they're making the right decisions, I should say. If they're making decisions just based off of, oh, hey, here's a name that might get us some book sales, so let's go after that. If they're actually going after it based on okay, I've read this guy's work or this girl's work, and I like it, and I think it would fit, I think they would be able to write James Bond, so we'll go after them. So it depends on the family's motivation for picking who they pick. But if their motivation is right, meaning they're going for someone who they feel can write the character well, then I think it could work fantastically. If all they're interested in sales, then it's not going to be any different than any other franchise. You're not going to get quality, you're going to get names. I mean, it's just like, corporate sponsorships or endorsements. You're going to get the name. That doesn't necessarily mean the quality. Could be there, could not be there, but hey, you've got a name, so you'll get a few sales based on that alone.
I think that in the case of this particular series, I think it is at least them trying to do the right thing. Just because none of the names really are ones that would have jumped out as, oh my God, they got Stephen King, or something like that.
I think the closest to that might have been Jeffery Deaver. He was a very prolific author before he wrote Carte Blanche.
I would say that's the only one out of this whole group that really stands out as one of those kinds of names.
That was, honestly, that was the reason I picked up Carte Blanche, is because I saw, oh, Jeffery Deaver wrote this. Oh, that's awesome. I like Bond. I like Jeffery Deaver because I like his work. I'd read a lot of his other stuff. Most people recognize him probably from The Bone Collector, which was turned into a really crappy movie. But the book was quite a bit better. I actually really enjoyed his mystery series that he wrote, basically featuring his one major character, who was the main character in, I believe, wasn't it? Who played him in?
Bone Collector?
The Bone Collector, yeah. It was Angelina Jolie. Denzel Washington, that's right. So that's kind of, like, I saw that movie and I was like, this seems like one of those movies where the book is probably better. And so I went and found the book, and sure enough, the book was a lot better. And so I ended up reading pretty much the entire Lincoln Rhyme series. I read several of his Catherine Dance books as well. The only ones I didn't get into, he did a Rune trilogy that I wasn't a big fan of, but I read a few of his standalones as well, and I really enjoyed most of them. And that's why I picked up Carte Blanche, was based on the name. So if that's why they chose him, then it worked, at least on me.
Well, since we're already talking about that, rather than go in chronological order, since Carte Blanche really, out of all of these, is a standalone novel, it completely ignores the previous canon of Ian Fleming, and it's a reboot. It is a hard reboot, with James Bond being born in the 70s, and him first coming in as a special agent when we meet him in the quote-unquote modern day of 2011. And him being a veteran of wars in Afghanistan and so on. This is a really hard reboot, and it goes in definitely different directions than Ian Fleming ever considered, while still retaining a little bit of the canon in terms of the names of his parents are the same. He's still a British agent, and he's still going on far-flung adventures, but realistically, if you took away the name James Bond, this to me did not feel at all like a James Bond book. What do you think?
I kind of agree. I actually enjoyed the book. I remember when we were first starting discussion about this episode, you had specifically said that you were going to completely rip this one apart. And I was like, you know what, I read that, and I don't remember hating it. I kind of skimmed over the synopses so I could make sure that I was remembering the book correctly. And again, I don't remember hating the book. I didn't think it was great. It wasn't a book that I went back to going, oh, this is fantastic. And it definitely wasn't one that I went to everybody I know and said, hey, you got to read this book. Check out this book. It's awesome. It was just one that I read through fairly quickly and enjoyed while I was reading it. And when I put it down, I didn't really think about it much after the fact, which is kind of the sign of a mediocre book to me. If I read a really bad book, I either quit halfway through or I have to tell everybody I know after the fact, don't ever read this pile of garbage. And then, of course, with a really good book, it's the opposite. I got to tell everybody, read this book. You know, it's like, I don't know how many people I've told to go pick up Piers Anthony's, but whatever. It's one of my favorite books of all time. I've read it a couple dozen times easily. And I got to tell everybody I meet, if we start talking about sci-fi at all, I'm like, oh, go get But What a Verse by Piers Anthony. You got to read this. You got to read it. That's how you know it's a great book. Carte Blanche for me was right down the middle. You know, it was enjoyable while I was reading it. If you're a fan of the Bond series and want to complete the collection, you know, it's kind of one of those where I would say only read this one if you're really interested in collecting the whole set and, you know, being able to say that you've read them all. Other than that, I'd say there's others out there that are better to go to first. This should be one of the last ones you pick up.
Okay. For me, just to touch on a little of the background that you mentioned, I don't approach books the same way. I can slog through almost anything, even if I hate it.
Okay.
I consider it almost a travesty to put a book down. I have, in fact, only ever done it once, ever.
I must know what that book was.
Going back to a series we discussed just a moment ago, The Courtship of Princess Leia by Dave Wolverton.
Oh, I remember that one. Oh, I read that. Oh, that was awful. Oh, there was a time back in 99 going into 2000 when I could officially say that I had read every single Star Wars novelization that had been written up to that point. I quickly lost track after that because so many more came out and I wasn't able to. I got a job working. I was working night shift at the time where I could literally read a book and a half every single shift because there was nothing else going on. So I read through so many Star Wars books, but yes, I remember that one unfondly.
It was just such a pile. In fact, I didn't just put it down. I put it down quickly. I mean, I
put it down and pushed it away from me. I took it out of my home. I didn't even take it. I didn't even donate it because I didn't want somebody else to maybe accidentally read it.
I have a copy of a lot of books. If I hadn't lost so much of my book collection to things like flood damage or moving to different countries, I would be able to have a small library right now. As it stands, I have books in every single room of my home, including the bathroom, just everywhere, large shelves. Having an e-reader this past year, because I first adopted e-readers this year, has just been such a weird experience, just because I'm so used to having the big, thick paper copies with me. You can almost tell the story of my life by picking up a book, because I read while I eat, and I will put the receipt from the restaurant that I ate in the book, and it will stay there. So you can tell when I read a book and where I was eating while I was reading whatever book I had. And because I have a close to photographic memory, I very rarely reread books. It has to be a long time coming. And that's why, actually, some of the other books that we're going to be discussing are among the only ones I've ever reread, and they're from my original copies of paperback editions from when they first came out.
Wow.
Still sitting on my shelf next to my liquor cabinet, as it turns out.
Yeah, well, I will admit that of these four that we're going to talk about today, the only one that I had previously read was Carte Blanche. And again, that was, I picked it up specifically because of the name, Jeffery Deaver, and I was like, oh, I like him and I like Bond, so I'll check this out. For me, it was actually one of the first, other than Casino Royale, it was one of the first Bond novels that I had read. So it was pretty much the only thing I had to compare it to was Casino Royale at that point. So maybe that's a little bit what colored my interpretation of it. It wasn't as hard a reboot to me because I didn't have as much of the universe already in my head from other novels. So maybe that colored why I was able to enjoy it a little bit more than you are.
I would say that would probably be exactly what must have done it, because for me, the moment I saw James Bond on the cover as, heading up even above the title of the book, it says James Bond. And then the moment I saw James Bond as the name of the character as I'm reading the book, I'm reading it as a James Bond book now. And because of my thorough grounding in the series by that point, I'd read all of Ian Fleming's books, all of John Gardner's books, Raymond Benson's books. I'd read basically everything except the Kingsley Amis book that came before this. And so I really had some expectations there as far as what I wanted to look for.
Well, there's your problem right there.
That's exactly it.
You went in with
I
expectations.
couldn't read it as anything but a Bond movie.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a Bond book, sorry. Freudian slip. But I couldn't, and it just was so un-Bond to me from the very first that I could never get past it. If I had been reading it as a straight-up adventure novel, I would still put it at low mediocre, like basically better than when Tom Clancy went to crap, but probably on par with about when Clive Cussler started going to crap.
I never got into the Cussler books. People told me, oh, yeah, these are good reads, especially if you like series that, are ongoing and stuff, because I was always into that sort of thing. I liked the serial books, the books that you have 20 books around the same character. I really got into the Hieronymus Bosch stories. I really got into the Jeffery Deaver novels and things like that. I dig that. Even before that, I read a series by a Russian author. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but it was more of one of those kind of, 30s style hard-boiled detective type characters, but it was awesome. I loved it. And I read everything I could get my hands on. But yeah, I tried to read a couple of Cussler books, and then it just didn't grab me.
I would say that I feel about his books the same way that I feel about Stephen King's. The earlier, the better. Mm-hmm. For me, the one that I probably enjoyed reading the most, and it's his signature title, is Raise the Titanic. And of course, written before we realized that actually doing so would be impossible. I
don't think James Cameron hasn't tried.
Movie, by the way, much better than the movie. But that was a good book. I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed things like Night Probe, Vixen 3. But as things started going further, and he started licensing out his name so that it's Clive Cussler with this person, and finally Clive Cussler is written by this person.
Yeah.
But, by the way, if you haven't figured it out by now, anytime you see a double author novel where one author is way more famous than the other, the one who's way more famous, whose name is bigger and at the top, wrote a maybe 3,000 to 8,000 word sketch that the other person finished. That's how it usually works, seriously.
Yeah.
Now, there are some genuine collaborations out there, but those names tend to equal out, at least in some term. Like when you see Arthur C. Clarke and Gentry Lee, they're collaborating. Gentry Lee, genuine scientist and author. Arthur C. Clarke. I mean, just...
Who? No,
they're genuine collaborators. But when you see something like Tom Clancy and Scott Pelznick, or Steve Pelznick, or whatever Pelznick,
that guy.
Pelznick.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I remember originally when Clancy started branching out universes like NetForce and Power Plays, it just said Tom Clancy's Power Plays, and the first editions of those books didn't list a ghostwriter, but you could tell he didn't write it.
Yeah, you're like, wait a minute. He hasn't taken 4 pages to describe how the airplane works. This can't be Clancy.
Exactly. We'll get back to that in a little bit when we talk about another one of these authors. But in terms of Deaver, if I take it as something other than a James Bond novel, then, as I said, it's kind of a low mediocre adventure book. Because I'll be honest, as a James Bond novel, it just sucks for me. I hate this book as a James Bond novel, and it was actually annoying for me to get through when I'm reading it in that fashion. Now, as a straight up adventure, the lead character just didn't really. There was nothing really interesting about him. He was just some soldier boy type. There's nothing particularly gripping about his character. There's a subplot that shows up every so often as if they'd let him write another book, which they haven't, at least as of yet, where he stumbles upon these old files that suggest that once upon a time, Russian spies were after his family and may have actually been the ones who killed his parents. Because one of the things Deaver keeps is that Bond's parents died in a climbing accident in Switzerland. But what this book suggests is that it wasn't necessarily an accident, and that, in fact, it was an assassination against a double agent working for the British government. And, of course, just because we have to be all out of place and everything, they suggest the entire time that it's Bond's father, but, of course, by the end of the book, we figure out, no, it's Bond's mother.
Oh, dum dum dum. Yeah, I remember that vaguely. It was something about a cartridge or something. God,
yeah, steel cartridge.
Steel cartridge. Yeah, that's it. Operation Steel Cartridge, which I was like, what? Okay.
It's an interesting concept, but they don't do nearly enough with it, and it is so obviously put there as a device to create sequels. And honestly, I don't like it when first novels do that, because I think that's being very presumptive. If you haven't written your work to be an automatic trilogy, sold immediately as a trilogy, and marketed immediately as a trilogy, this is going to sound really arrogant to me, but I don't think you have the right to market it in that fashion.
Right.
You haven't proven yourself yet. You haven't earned it. It's like we were talking about in the movie for Casino Royale. Daniel Craig had to earn the right to say Bond, James Bond at the end, and he did. But with this reboot by Jeffery Deaver, I don't think he does. And Bond as an Afghanistan war veteran who just gets taken on as not a 00, but just as some kind of special SAS agent, it just seems it's just off to me.
Mm-hmm. It's almost as if I wonder if perhaps like the majority of this story, I'm wondering if Deaver maybe had this outline somewhere that he hadn't used for one of his other novels, and then when he was approached to do the Bond novel, he's like, oh yeah, I got just the thing for this. A little tweak here, a little tweak there, and boom, here we go.
I don't think that's implausible at all. I mean, you see it in movies all the time.
Oh yeah.
For example, there's a movie out there called Werewolf in a Girl's Dormitory, which very obviously
sounds like quality filmmaking just from the title.
Oh, it is. Not really. You can tell it was not originally written as a werewolf movie. It was written as a murder mystery. And somebody said, hey, we want to buy a movie about werewolves. And the author said, oh, here you go.
You see, the script everywhere that it says werewolf, it's actually scratched out. Murderer is scratched out, and werewolf is just written in pencil. What's this about? It's like, yeah, that's how I write. Deal with it. Where's my check?
When's the last time you heard of a werewolf strangling all of its victims? That's how this thing plays out. Really, really crappy black and white Italian horror movie. If you're a serious devotee of lousy movies like I am, go ahead and check it out. You'll find it on any number of compilations that have like 50 titles for $20. But
it's probably on Netflix. Oh.
But I can buy into your theory that this might have been an outline waiting to happen for something else.
It seems possible because the basis of it is enough different from what we would traditionally associate with Bond. And, with a vague outline of something, you could fit in details like, first of all, name is no big deal, whatever. But then it could have been that it may have even been a spy thriller. It might have even been something that he intended to have be with, espionage-type agents. And then he just converted it.
I can see that. So another thing that annoyed me about how the plot is constructed is, in this particular story, you're following this trail of intrigue with this guy in South Africa who is plotting to do a couple of different things. He wants to raise money by by selling his technology to governments, with which he takes their old computers and completely scraps them so there's no possible way that they can recover information off the hard drives. However, just before they go through the shredder, there's this magic machine which in like half a second copies everything that was on the hard drive, which he then, of course, can sell to the highest bidding terrorist.
But of course. Sounds perfectly logical Bond plot to me so far. Go on.
The thing is, it could be. I can see a Bond villain doing this. The details of how it's done are sketchy at best. I mean, if you know technology at all, this is a bit far-fetched in terms of the way it's described how they do it. Like, you have completely bare hard drive about to go through shredder, and in less than a second, they're copying the whole damn thing. It's just a little too much. But you follow that, and then you find out that this guy also wants to bomb something in England, and you go through this, most of the novel dealing with this. And then you find out you've been wasting your frickin' time, the entire book, because it's all been a red herring. I was so pissed off at that point. Even as a mediocre adventure, I mean, that's not a plot twist. That's a plot wedgie. We're just like, this is bullshit. You've just wasted my time. I mean, I understand a little misdirection and so on and so forth, but to the point where you realize that all of this has been meant to be a distraction, a very convolutedly set up distraction to sparking a conflict in Africa, set up by, of course, the person we thought was going to be the Bond girl, who has a really, really nifty name, by the way, Felicity Willing.
Of course she is.
I like her name. I do like her name, really. But I just couldn't sit with it. I mean, as a mediocre adventure novel, I could have been like, meh, and when I was done, but as a James Bond novel, I just hated this thing. Just top to bottom, hated it.
Have you read any of Deaver's other stuff?
I have, and I've enjoyed that more.
Okay.
It's just, again, I think you hit it right on the head with the prejudice thing. I walked in with a prejudice, and it colored my opinion of everything.
And that's understandable. I mean, that's if you're going to write a novel in someone else's universe, you have to be aware that the majority of the people who read the book are probably going to come in with that kind of mindset. And they're expecting it to fit into their world. And if it doesn't, you're going to have a bad time. If you want to write a one-off novel about something similar, then perhaps you could get away with it. But for something like this, you really have to be able to really pull it off. And if you don't, you end up with the real fans that have been following the series from the very beginning, like you, hating it, and people like me who got into it as a casual Bond fan at the time. I mean, like I said, I read this one when it first came out. I actually had the first edition hardcover of this one and picked up at, I think I had a gift card for Borders, I think it was, as a matter of fact. Which
I think that's exactly how I bought my first edition hardcover as well, come to think of it.
And so, I just saw, I was like, oh, Jeffery Deaver, I like his stuff, and hey, Bond, that's cool too. So that's why I picked it up. And I'm not ranting and raving about it by any means, but I enjoyed it more, but not enough that I would be like, oh yeah, Jeffery Deaver should totally continue writing Bond books. No, I think the one and done is okay in this situation because I think others probably have done it better.
Yeah, we're definitely not talking Carly Simon here. But, it just didn't sit well with me. I was happy it was a one and done. I mean, and the dumb thing is, the thing I like best about it, now, what I find odd and interesting, especially considering how I just discussed things before, is that the thing I enjoy the most about Carte Blanche as a Bond novel is that subplot, which I just got done saying a few moments ago I didn't feel like he had the right to add in. But to clarify that, the part that bothers me about it is that he weaves this in almost from the very beginning and keeps it going throughout the course of the book, even though it has nothing to do with the plot at hand. It's something that he just keeps nodding at it in the background. So he's establishing his arc for a series. And that's what seems really presumptuous to me, because unlike with Daniel Craig waiting till the end of the Casino Royale film to say, Bond, James Bond, when you know he's earned the right to, we haven't had that happen yet. Now, if he had introduced the idea of Russian agents having killed his parents as just a single thing that just shows up at one point that could be built on as sequel material later, that would have been all right with me. And the concept of it is the most interesting thing to me about this book as a Bond novel. But the rest of it just doesn't sit. And I'm particularly thinking of one scene where Bond is asked to prove his loyalty by killing somebody. And he's handed a gun, and he decides that it's okay to shoot because he can tell by the weight of the gun that he's been handed blanks.
That's skill. That's
yeah.
That's some serious skill right there. I do remember that, and it's kind of one of those things that if it would have been okay if it had been like, okay, you could tell by the weight that he had been handed an empty gun, because I would think that a secret agent should be able to tell the difference between a fully loaded gun. I mean, 11, 12, 13, however many bullets fit in that particular style of gun, they do have some weight to them. And yes, blanks will weigh a little less, but if it's completely empty, that is a noticeable difference. Of course, the difference between it being completely empty and having one bullet in the chamber is negligible and probably not noticeable. But you could definitely tell the difference if you were familiar enough with a particular model of gun. I think that you could easily tell the difference between a fully loaded gun and a fully empty gun. but being able to tell 100%, no, this one, it's just a little too light. Because, I mean, the difference between a gun loaded with blanks and a gun loaded with, maybe 3 less bullets than full capacity would be about the same. And all you need is 1 in there to actually kill somebody. So, yeah, that was a little bit too much. But then again, it's kind of one of those things where you want James Bond to be that super badass. You want James Bond to be that super agent who can tell so many things just by feel and intuition. So maybe not just by the weight of the gun, but also by the mannerisms. Maybe they just knew, maybe there was something they were giving off that I'm trying to justify it, and it's not working out very well. I can't justify that. I'm usually pretty good at that.
I want James Bond to be that badass, but I want James Bond's character in this book. And so my overall judgment, and it sounds like the dog agrees with me, is that Carte Blanche just is not sitting anywhere near the top of the pile.
I can agree with that. I definitely don't think it's one of the best Bond novels, not even one of the best Bond novels outside of Fleming's work. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's as bad as you say it is, but at the same time, again, I put this as one of the last ones to read. Really, you only need to read this one if you really want to be able to say that you've read them all. If you want that, to be able to be like, yeah, I did it, then yeah, of course, you want to read this one as well. But other than that, no.
I will say I applaud the experiment. I applaud the idea of trying.
I definitely recommend anybody out there to go read Jeffery Deaver's other work. If you haven't experienced any of the Lincoln Rhyme novels, for example, and you like mystery, action, suspense type novels that are quick, easy reads, not going to make you think too much, but also aren't going to completely insult your intelligence, those books are definitely good for that.
Well, speaking of quick, easy reads that aren't going to make you think too much, let's move on to another one of our authors, the one that was the most prolific in terms of the James Bond novels, outside of Ian Fleming, of course, and he came close. That would be Mr. John Garnder, who started writing during the early 1980s. Now, what I find interesting about these is he decided to keep all of Ian Fleming's canon in terms of, what happened in Ian Fleming's novels really happened as far as this James Bond was concerned. However, he somehow skipped 20 years of time so
as
that...
one does.
And I'm not talking in the 60s trip-out fashion where, dude, where'd the 70s go?
I had one too many martinis and I woke up 20 years later. I don't even know what happened. I'm guessing that I was shaken, not stirred.
Rip Van Bond. Basically what he decided is that from the time of the end of the stories, that the novel of The Man with the Golden Gun, to the beginning of the 1980s, James Bond basically just skipped time, just didn't age. He gave him a little gray hair at the temples, but in other terms than that, he did not physically age. So he's basically a man in his, I think it would be early 40s at that point.
But that's okay, because it's Bond. Look at, he jumps time throughout the movies as well. When you go to a younger actor, all of a sudden you're like, okay, we're acknowledging that all this stuff maybe happened before, except when you get to the reboot versions. But we're acknowledging that all this stuff happened before, yet somehow James Bond is 20 years younger than, he's not even the same age 20 years later. He's actually younger and in the future. So I can sort of forgive that. Because I don't think they leaned too heavily on the past canon. There were definitely, moments when they would mention things that if you didn't know what had happened before, you would have just thought it was, extra. But if you knew what happened before, you're like, oh yeah, he's talking about what happened there. All right. I think it was just enough that if you knew what you were looking for, it catered to you. But if you didn't, it wouldn't have bored you. So I thought he actually did okay with that aspect of it. The time difference, I guess it doesn't really bother me that much when I think of James Bond because he jumps around so much as it is, and because I don't watch the movies in chronological order all the time. I just watch whatever one feels right at that moment that I want to watch. And so I guess I can let that pass, kind of.
Yeah, I can too. To be honest, that doesn't bother me at all. It's just something that's worthy of note because it is not necessarily the same as all the other books we're discussing, like certainly not with Jeffery Deaver's, and it won't be the case with William Boyd either. Mm-hmm. So I just thought that was worth pointing out.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not discounting your feelings. Don't make it sound like I'm discounting your feelings. You have the right to have their feelings. One thing I give you permission to feel, okay? One thing I really did like about this book is that it's the first time for me in a while, since I haven't read the novels recently, and it's been a while since I rewatched some of the older movies. Spectre is something we haven't seen for a while, due for legal reasons, of course, but always a welcome sight for me in a Bond story.
Yeah, and I still don't get how this made it through the legal wrangling, because the book that we're going to be talking about is John Gardner's second James Bond book for Special Services.
Yeah, we should probably mention the one we're specifically talking about, shouldn't we?
Yeah. And another thing worth noting is that in his first James Bond book, he changed the rules just a little bit. The 00 section has been dissolved. It's gone. It's done. But M wants to keep Bond on as basically his own personal attack dog.
As one does. No, I don't know.
And so that's the approach that we have here, where Bond is in a little bit less of a structured thing and more of M's pet agent,
right,
so to speak.
Which kind of fits
we always
Bond's
kind of felt
personality.
that way anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's kind of, now it's almost more official how Bond's always acted. You know, Bond's always kind of acted as though he was outside of the normal scheme of things, and now in this particular series of novels, he really is.
Yeah, and as far as Spectre goes, it's considered that Spectre was defeated in the way that he was defeated in the Ian Fleming novels. They were defeated, the Ian Fleming novels, with James Bond killing Blofeld in You Only Live Twice. So that canon is established. Blofeld is dead, dead, dead. And so we
By
have now
Bond's own hand, civically. Even if you haven't read the You Only Live Twice novel, they do kind of flash back to it, if you will. In this one, sure they know exactly what's happened.
And in this particular instance, we're also looking at the early 1980s.
Yes.
So just as when we were talking about For Your Eyes Only and Octopussy, when we were discussing the films, these novels very much take place in the era of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And they take James Bond back to where Ian Fleming had him, as stridently anti-communist. I mean, he has nothing good to say about those dirty Reds, and he actually uses phrases that are very close to that. He is definitely very anti-communist, very anti-red with a capital R, and it shows. So this is not the conciliatory détente that you see in the films done by Eon, but rather, no, this is very much a, we're Britain, damn it, and therefore we don't like those Soviet commie bastards.
Which I'm okay with, especially in novelization form. I really, it's all based on, for me, it should be based on when the book is set. More so than when the book is written, per se, but when the book is set, I don't have a problem with it. What I do have a problem with is people going back to a book afterward when sensibilities have changed and trying to censor it to today's ideas. Recently with the Huckleberry Finn novels, they were talking about going back through and editing out the N-word from the novels, and I think that's just an absolutely horrible, atrocious idea, because that's...
It is awful, and the literary term for that is Bowdlerization, and that comes from the name of somebody who did that to Shakespeare's plays. And you can actually tell, if you enjoy English literature at all, which of Shakespeare's plays are Bowdlerized and which ones aren't. You can, if you read through two different editions, you'll notice that sometimes they're different, and one will have a little bit less blatant sexuality, and it'll have little dance numbers in it. That's a Bowdlerized version of the play. And
as soon as they start dancing, this isn't right.
It's like, you can really, really tell in Macbeth. If the version of Macbeth that you're reading includes the three witches doing a dance number and does not include the drunken porter answering the castle door and urinating on his way to the door, then you're reading a Bowdlerized version.
Yeah, I don't agree with that whatsoever. I think that once the book is written, it should be judged based on, and like I said, not even when it's written, but when it's set. Is what's happening in the novel appropriate for when the novel is set? And if it is, then leave it the heck alone.
Yeah, and for that value, I think that John Gardner's novels, at least in the early 80s and really all the way through, those hit the mark. They're definitely speaking of their times. And I would compare them similarly to the Clive Cussler novels of the same period. I admit that if I'm going to look back as overall adventures, I would probably rate most of the Cussler novels better than their contemporaries in John Gardner's Bond universe, but I also remember enjoying all of Gardner's novels when I read them through the first time. Now, granted, I was not nearly the sophisticated individual I am now, i.e. not necessarily an adult.
Well, I can help you out with that because I only first read this book very recently, within the last few weeks, as a matter of fact, to prepare for this particular show. And I can tell you that I actually did quite enjoy this book. It's definitely not the best ever novel I've ever read. It's not even the best Bond story I've ever read, but I did enjoy it. There was some stuff that was obviously contrived, but no more so than Moonraker or any other Bond movie.
You had to pull that one out. Yes.
What I'm saying is that even though it's contrived, you can still enjoy it because it's so Bond. The parts that are contrived to me in just the right way to be very Bondish. Now here's a question I meant to ask about the last book as well. I actually wanted to ask you this about all of the books because I kind of started thinking about it as I was reading it. But which, for this one here, for Special Services, which Bond actor would you most envision being Bond in this story?
Thank you for asking that, because I'd actually been thinking about that for all of these books as we were going through them. And I meant to bring that up, and I'd forgotten about that.
Great minds think alike. That was one of the first things I thought of as I started reading them. I'm like, who am I picturing? Because obviously when you've seen movies of a character, you automatically start to picture them, whether you want to or not sometimes. I mean, like, I've gone back and reread, I read the Harry Potter novels before they were made into movies. And I've gone back and reread the first couple of them. And all of a sudden, I'm like, I see Radcliffe as Harry Potter, even though that's not who I envisioned when I first read them. It affects you. When you've seen a movie, a film version of a book, and then read it, you do get that picture in your head automatically. But with Bond, you've got several to choose from. You don't just have one image that pops up. You've got several to choose from. So I thought it was interesting that I personally had different images pop up for each of these books. So who immediately comes to mind for Special Services for you?
Well, since you wanted to know about the first novel that we talked about as well, for Carte Blanche,
yes,
even though when we were having our discussion of the best Bonds and so on, I told you I could picture Daniel Craig in any era, and that's true.
Mm-hmm.
But because of how the character was written and listening to him speak, I quickly had to turn him into Pierce Brosnan for Carte Blanche.
Okay. And
how about for you?
For me, also Pierce Brosnan, but I think that was also colored by, at the time that I had read that novel, the majority of my Bond experience had been Brosnan. At that time, I had pretty much seen just the Brosnan movies and For Your Eyes Only. So to say that any of the others even had a chance when I first read that would kind of, I definitely wasn't thinking, that was pretty much the only one on my mind at the time.
Okay.
So that one's really not fair. But the other ones, I had read these all recently, and so I had all of the various Bond actors fresh in my mind.
Now, for Special Services, it was automatically in there from the moment I first read it, and it has never left. It's been the book's contemporary, Roger Moore.
Really? And
even when he was no longer contemporary to the Gardner books, I still picture Roger Moore. Now, it's probably the Roger Moore, physically speaking, more of the Spy Who Loved Me 1977. So just before he got that little more mature cut to him that you would get in For Your Eyes Only, but still definitely Roger Moore is who I picture for any of the John Gardner books.
Really? Now, I'll be honest, I haven't read any of the other Gardner books that I can recall other than this one. But for this one, and I differ a little bit. For some reason, the first one that came to my mind right at the very opening scene of the book was Dalton. I actually thought of Dalton because it seemed to me a little bit more rough and tumble, but not on the level of Daniel Craig. But more so than Connery, and definitely more so than Moore for me. So Dalton was who immediately popped into my head.
Interesting. I think I can picture that. I think I can. It's not who came to my mind, but I think I can picture that. Right.
All right. For me, that's who immediately popped into my head, and part of it could be this was one of the books that I actually consumed on audiobook format. I was listening to this book, and the person who read it, I can't recall their name off the top of my head. I'd have to look it up, but they did a very good job. It wasn't a complete dramatization where they did like all the different voices and stuff stuff like that, but it was very well read where they did change inflection and such from character to character so that you got a sense of who was speaking without necessarily them telling, even though they did because they were reading the book. They weren't ad-libbing, they weren't going off script or anything like that, but there's a difference. There's different books that have been dramatized, where you've got different voices for different characters, you've got different people reading them, or at least doing voices. With this one, it wasn't necessarily voices so much, it was just different inflections, different timing, different cadence to the words that let you know that it was a different character speaking, and he was able to keep it consistent, so you always knew which character was speaking based on how he was delivering dialogue. And that may have had an impact on who I pictured, because the inflection and the timing and the cadence may have been more Dalton than anybody else, or at least in my mind when I first started hearing it.
All right. Interesting. Now, the reason that I chose this particular book to represent John Garnder when I was coming up with the list of stuff that we should read was the number of canon characters and organizations that happen to show up in this book. Because not only do we have James Bond, M, Moneypenny, Q, who is called Major, but, I mean, I understand that's his title. It just seemed kind of formal. But
okay. Yeah, you definitely had that.
You also have, as you mentioned, our villains are Spectre.
Yep.
And like I said, I haven't quite figured out how this made it through the legal wrangling, and I'm not going to bother looking it up at the moment. And what we have is a resurgent Spectre that is trying to come back from Bond having killed their glorious leader all those ages ago, skipping 20 of them. And the way they're doing it is they're having these high-price heists. And kind of the sort of thing that you overheard, if you remember from the Bond films, when you would see the members of Spectre gathered in the room and number one asking for reports, and you'd hear, well, this scam made us 300 million. Oh, this scam made us X million, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of like that kind of vibe going again.
Right.
Which is an interesting start, and they don't know it's Spectre at first. They figure it out. And we know it's Spectre at first because, of course, marketers can't resist going straight for the second and third act, and they put it right in the blurb on the back of the book. Which I think the book might have been more effective if they hadn't done that. I mean, yeah, I knew in advance because I'd read the book before, but it's just a lot of the suspense that you can tell Gardner is trying to build up as he writes is gone because you know who the villains are. But so you have Spectre, and you also have Felix Leiter, the literary Felix Leiter, and his daughter Cedar. Bum, bum, bum.
Certainly Bond's not going to sleep with the daughter of his best American friend, is he?
Boy, do they belabor the hell out of that question.
That was one part of the book that I did not particularly enjoy. I kind of went back and forth on it because it was obvious that she wanted to. It was obvious that his charms were working on her, but he was like, "No, I can't do that. I love my friend too much to sleep with his daughter." Blah blah blah. And then of course, he ends up being like, "Hey, if you want to hit that, go for it." Basically.
And that is what bothered the most. I was already kind of annoyed by just how they belabored the whole, no, you're my best friend's daughter. Oh, but James, I want you so much. But you're my best friend's daughter. Oh, but it'll be okay. Really? I promise.
That'll be cool, man. That'll be cool.
And he belabors this forever. And from the moment they meet at what's basically the end of the first act, all the way through the entire rest of the novel, they keep coming back to this. And it's ping pong that gives you whiplash after a while. And then you get to the point where Felix actually gives James Bond a written note giving him permission to fuck his daughter. What the hell is this?
Exactly. Like I said, he's like, "Yeah, it's cool. You can hit that. It's all right." Yeah, that part, I was like, you know what? I would have rather seen... if he'd have come to Felix and said, "Hey, listen, if it had been an actual love story of some sort, but it's just going to end up being another one of his one-night stands, or maybe a few night stands at the most, but it doesn't have a future, that, and they didn't write it that way as if it was going to have a future, so you really didn't get that sense. And then for him to be like, "No, seriously, it's cool," no, I don't see that. I would rather have him send a note saying, "Hey, I know you've been hanging out with my daughter, don't you dare." I may only have one arm and one leg, but I will mess you up.
And the chapter title and the note are even written with the phrase, quote unquote, the gift of a daughter.
Forget about that.
Damn, dude.
I don't know if maybe the only thing I can think is that...
That hangs up right there with Ian Fleming's The Sweet Tang of Rape.
Maybe that's what he was going for. I don't know. But, yeah, the only thing I can think is that maybe Felix had this notion that his daughter would be the one to settle the great James Bond down. You have to think that Felix is smarter than that. I mean, he's always been written as smarter than that. But maybe, just maybe he thinks that this is you know what? These two will settle each other down and they'll live happily ever after. Nobody thinks that. Nobody else in the world thinks that, Felix. Dude, seriously. Don't let that man touch your daughter.
It just creeped me the fuck out. I mean, that's the only way I can put it. And now, in a wild, amazing twist, Bond doesn't do it. And I think he read the note and got creeped out as I was. I'd like to say he did, but I honestly, and I think this is another reason I'm reinforced with the image of Roger Moore. I remember thinking of Roger Moore commenting that the reason he knew he had to stop after View to a Kill was he could have been Tanya Roberts' grandfather. And I think that's about where I'm at with this.
Now, I will say that the final plot, I don't want to give too much away because people might still want to read this book. Yes, it has been since 1982, but I'm not going to spoil it completely. The final plot twist I only saw coming very near the end, which is good because typically I overthink books and TV shows and movies and basically anything I consume. I tend to overthink them, and most of the time twists like this are not a surprise. By the time it gets to them, I'm like, yeah, saw that coming. This one I did not quite see until very near the end when I thought, wait a minute, just maybe, and then boom. I was like, all right, you know. So it did actually sneak up on me a little bit more than a lot of twists do. Was it able to sneak up on you, or did you see it coming from a mile away?
I'm thinking we need to play poker.
Wow. Ouch.
It jumped out at me pretty quickly.
It hurts me.
I'll tell you why, but in order to do that, I might have to spoil it. I'll try not to. The plot twist we're talking about basically involves the leadership of Spectre.
Yes.
I think it's very, very telling and they immediately say that the leader of Spectre is Blofeld. Now, that's all they say, is that the leader is Blofeld. Now, from that point on, Blofeld is only referred to as Blofeld, never with a pronoun.
Yes.
Whoa! Big red flag to me. The moment they never use a pronoun, that tells me that they're really obviously trying not to say something that would be revealed by a pronoun. I'm immediately looking in a certain direction.
Okay. See, when I read that, I saw that as well, but I thought that immediately to mean, okay, it's not actually a real Blofeld. I immediately thought that they were using that as a code name, that they were using the Blofeld name assigned to somebody else to convey the leadership aspect without it actually being an actual relative of Blofeld. That's why I thought originally that they were not using any specific pronoun. But again, it wasn't until a little bit... I will say I did get an inkling when he was shown the secret entrance, like, out of nowhere. I was like, why did that happen? Why? Yeah, I'm a little bit... somebody's up to something here. But I didn't have it completely flipped around at that point. It wasn't until a little bit closer to the end when I was like, wait a minute, just maybe, and then it ended up being that. So I still say read the book. Give us a holler over on our Facebook page. You can find us at facebook.com/Her Majesty's Secret Pod. Or, I'm sorry, Her Majesty's Pod. Secret's not in there, just facebook.com/Her Majesty's Pod. You can also visit us on the web at hermajestiespod.com. And on Twitter at twitter.com/Her Majesty's Pod. Amazing how that works. And after you read the book, let us know when you were clued in on the big secret twist ending, the M. Night Shyamalan ding dong twist at the end there.
And if you want, you can also email me directly. I'm at Ziggy@cinemaontherocks.com. I'm also on Twitter at CinemaOTR.
I'm also on the Twitters by myself at Eric J. Dewey, and you can email me at eric@foureyedradio.com. And find me on Facebook, too. Just search for Socially Awkward Eric. Socially Awkward, one word as the first name, Eric as the last name. I accept all friend requests on that account, so give me a friend request and we can chit-chat about Bond, about science, about beer, about anything you want to, really. I don't even care. I've got no limits. Well, I've got some limits, but I'll leave it up to you to find out what they are.
But anyway...
So what else?
The other thing that did it for me is, at least as I read him, John Garner's red herrings smell like red herrings. Big, fat, stinky-ass red herrings. And so every time he mentions something that could lead you in the direction, you know that that is exactly the wrong way you want to look. So whenever he goes out of his way to not lead you in a direction, that's the direction you need to go.
Well, you just ruined the whole rest of his series for me. No, I'm just kidding.
Maybe it's just because I've always really analyzed the hell out of everything that I read, but it jumped out at me, and I'm pretty sure that even when I read this the first time, I'd figured it out early. I can't say for sure. It's a long time ago, but I definitely had it jump out at me almost right away as I was reading it this time. So going back to a point we were discussing a little bit earlier where you said, well, you know, it's not going to be the love of James Bond's life. And I know I have you at a disadvantage here from having read all of Gardner's work. But one thing that it didn't bother me when I read it the first time around. But this time around, Gardner has a tendency. His version of James Bond is not portrayed so much as a love him and leave him. It's I could really fall in love with this woman every single time. It happens in this book. It happens in the next one. He actually does have a couple of steady lady friends later on in the series. He gets a couple of them. One of them he even comes close to marrying. He's very much looking for the next Tracy in every book. And I think you see that in this book, too.
You do a little bit, but because I haven't read any of the other books, I kind of thought of it as a one-off. On this one, I thought it was I thought it was more of the intrigue of the difference. And then at the end, when you find out what you find out, I thought it was kind of okay, now I see what he was drawn to was the duplicity of it. And, his own duplicity kind of attracts that, I think. So that's what I attributed it to when I read this particular book. But like you said, I haven't read the other novels that, if he repeats this pattern, then it just becomes kind of okay, so he's just lovesick.
Yeah, it's a definite pattern.
Okay. See, that's not what James Bond is supposed to be. He's supposed to be, he wants the physical pleasure, and the love is just something that maybe happens once in a blue moon. It happened once, but that's it. That's probably the only time it's ever going to happen until he's old and gray.
Yeah, whereas with Gardner, Bond is going for the physical pleasure, sure, but it's basically every second bed he starts thinking maybe. Because of course you got to have the bed that he crawls into where somebody's going to die.
Oh yeah, of course. There's always going to be somebody ended up painted in gold or covered in oil in his bed.
Of course. Now, as far as the general non-female plot goes and the general non-giving away everything about Spectre plot goes, it's convoluted as hell. And it is on a shoestring thread, Finn. But for everything that we've ever talked about with the movies, it's serviceable. I mean, it's literary critics
cream. You can't go wrong with ice cream.
You can't go wrong with ice cream, could you? Especially if it's made on a really, really super fortress-like compound in the middle of Texas that you can only access by private monorail. No, that's got to be the most tasty ice cream on earth, right?
If you've got to take a monorail through an electric fence to get it, it's got to be good ice cream. Come on. That was the biggest part that for me was like, really? You guys are going with ice cream?
I was actually okay with that.
Well, no, I got okay with it because, like I said, I accepted it as being that kind of old-timey Bond cheesiness. The type of stuff that we saw in Diamonds Are Forever and in Moonraker, these type of just over-the-top villain plot. I don't mind that. If that's what it is, as long as they commit to it, as long as they commit to this is going to be the whole thing is going to be crazy. What I don't like is when they have a serious, plausible plot, and then like one key point is completely out there that just makes it totally ridiculous. I don't like that. But if the whole thing is out there from the very beginning, bring it on.
It was enjoyable. It started to lose me when you have the twist of why Blofeld has not been killing Bond the entire time, even though Blofeld has had every frickin' opportunity on Earth to kill Bond. When we find out why, that just strikes me as a little bit too much, but I could still go along with it. And on that note, in order for that to make sense, you have to assume that Blofeld has really not been trying to kill Bond this whole time. But Blofeld has tried to kill Bond at least twice, deliberately, without doing it Blofeld's self, to avoid using pronouns. And it's like crap or get off the pot. Make up your mind. Do one or the other. I don't think Gardner quite knew. And then
I attributed that to just kind of the basic Bond villain ego trip. You know, when it gets down to, like, they have no problem. The Bond villain never has any problem just ordering, yeah, go ahead and kill that guy. You know, whatever. But then when it comes down to, you know, I've sent 3 assassins after you and they have all failed. Now I must kill you myself in an intricate plot, which I will not witness personally. Yeah. I will go away first and give you time to escape to prove if you're worthy or not. Yeah, it kind of comes on. I mean, that's why Austin Powers was made. Because
I'll go between trying to kill you and fucking with you.
Exactly. It's a mind game. The Bond villain's ego is so big that they want it to be. They think that they're prolonging the torture by giving them an opportunity to escape that they can't possibly escape. And then they're shocked when Bond figures out a way to escape.
And then when you get to the end, it's like, oh shit, my page count's almost up. I better end this thing. And he ends it in about like 5-6 pages.
I did notice that the ending was very abrupt. It reminded me a little bit of, I've always said this about Jurassic Park 3. Did you ever notice how Jurassic Park 3 just ended? It's like build up. Okay, they're rescued. Wait, what? Yeah, did they run out of money? Did they just like, okay, crap, we have to end this? And they did.
Gardner
they just ended it.
Longer to give, quote unquote, the gift of a daughter than he does to actually end his freaking plot.
It does end quite abruptly. I felt it was satisfying enough, but it was not exceptionally satisfying. It wasn't like, oh, this is fantastic. This is a great ending. I'm glad they expounded on everything. No, because they didn't. But I did feel that it was sufficient for. Again, it felt to me, I kind of looked at it as a Bond movie in written form, and that's kind of how it goes. You get a lot of build-up. I think a lot of Bond movies tend to build up quite a bit before you get to finally find out who the bad guy is, what the bad guy wants, and then Bond foils him and it's over.
I would call this a low-end Bond movie, but
it's fair.
Still enjoyable enough. And then the other thing that I noticed, you notice this especially in Tom Clancy, whose work wouldn't come to prominence until later in the decade, where he wants to prove that he knows what he's writing about. So he can never say he picked up the gun. No, he picked up the Ruger Super Blackhawk with this, that, and the next thing.
Which weighed 9.327 ounces, fully loaded.
And Gardner can never say that James Bond got in the car. In fact, he never uses you will never, throughout the course of this entire book, see got in the car or drove the car, but rather, drove the Saab Muslane Turbo. Always the name of the car. It's like Saab paid him to do this. Now, he says that, no, he got the idea from a friend. I'm like, what, did the friend work for Saab? I mean,
got the idea from my good friend, director of marketing for Saab International Motorsports?
Because it sounds like product placement. In fact, the thing that comes to mind, if you have ever seen Return of the Killer Tomatoes, which just for the fact that John Astin and George Clooney are in it. Yes, George Clooney, before anyone knew who the hell he was, is in the Killer Tomatoes sequel. And they do deliberate product placement. Let's get on our Honda Quad Runner. That's how I felt every time they talked about the Saab Buzzlane Turbo.
My favorite product placement in a movie has to be in Kung Pao Enter the Fist. When they are just so ridiculously blatant. I mean, the whole movie is set in old-timey kung fu movies, but yet Taco Bell paid for product placement. So, by golly, they product placed Taco Bell. And they sang a little song about it. Product placement, product placement, product placement with Taco Bell.
I think my favorite, and it's one of the more subtly done ones, from the movie The Shadow, Alec Baldwin.
Okay.
Which I consider very underrated, by the way.
I recall enjoying that movie, so yeah, okay.
The way to approach that movie is to remember it's based on a radio play and realize that it's filmed like a radio play. But there's a discussion between Alec Baldwin as Lamont Cranston and John Lone as our villain, who is supposed to be the last descendant of Genghis Khan, even though, folks, 2% of the world's population is descended from Genghis Khan. The dude had that much sex. They've proven this, okay? I mean,
he was like the James Bond of ancient China.
Yeah. but they're having a discussion and they're just talking, and suddenly the villain says, "Hey, that's a very nice suit. Thank you. I got it from Brooks Brothers on 25th and Main." And it's just like the product placement in an old-time radio ad, which I thought was hilarious. Very well done. But I felt that the product placement of the Saab Muslane Turbo felt much more Return of the Killer Tomatoes-ish in this movie. Whether or not it was paid for by Saab, if not, Saab got a lot of free advertising. And it doesn't quite reach the obnoxious heights of Tom Clancy describing every gun on Earth in his novels, but you're getting there. You can see that Clancy didn't just invent that himself. The detail porn was there before him. So I suppose in the end, I treat Force Special Services in much the same way that I treat a lot of Jean-Claude Van Damme's movies, in terms of we're looking at Kickboxer, Bloodsport, that kind of thing. Whereas if you take it as a movie by itself, just mediocre, it's kind of there, but it's fun. And that's basically where I am with this. If you take out the part about the ping pong about, am I going to shtup his daughter or not? Because that does get genuinely annoying. Yep. This book is fun despite being relatively not good.
That's kind of, I would almost 100% agree with that assessment. It is a fun book, especially in the spectrum of a James Bond novel. It has all the necessary elements of a James Bond novel, including the cheesiness of the plot, of the villain's plot, and how they carry it out, and of course how Bond defeats them. So I'm totally okay with it in that spectrum. If you were to take this book and change the names and make it not a Bond book, I would probably classify it as a subpar action-adventure novel. It wouldn't have the same... I wouldn't accept some of the contrivances that I accept because it's a Bond book. You know what I mean?
I would agree.
But it is a fun book to read. I definitely recommend checking it out, whether you do it. I personally recommend, I enjoyed it on the audiobook format. I got it through Audible, and it was very well done. I thought it was a very good read, a very good listen. I think it was just under 10 hours of total audio time, so it goes by fairly quickly. It's not something that's going to take you months and months and months to listen to. I read it over the course of 2 days while at work, or listened to it, I should say, over the course of a couple of days while at work. And it's very well done as an audiobook. Like I said, it's not a dramatization. They don't turn it into an audio play, but the narrator does do a good job of making sure you understand who's speaking when they're speaking.
And for my own part, I would say if you want to check out any of John Gardner's Bond novels, by all means, For Special Services is a good way to do it, because it's early enough in the series that he hasn't really established very much of his own stuff. So you can jump into this pretty cold and be fine. And because it has all of the back references to Spectre and Felix Leiter and so on, a casual Bond fan is going to find this more entertaining because there's a lot of familiar ground that's being covered.
Yes.
So I think this is a very good way to jump in. If you like other Bond books by Gardner that I remember enjoying and that have been highly recommended by some of our fans on our Facebook page. People were mentioning Scorpius and Icebreaker.
Yes.
I particularly remember enjoying Icebreaker. It's been a while since I've read it, but I remember that being my favorite of Gardner's books, just based on memory. So just go in with the right expectations. But by all means, if you have a choice between this and Carte Blanche, pick this.
Of the two we've talked about thus far, yes, I do think that this is a better Bond novel, and just slightly a better book in general. Although I do give Carte Blanche more credit as just a book than as a Bond novel. This one still beats it out just a bit. So, but especially if you're looking for a Bond novel, especially if you like if you've never read any of the Bond novels whatsoever and like the older Bond movies such as Moonraker and Diamonds Are Forever, these type of things, you'll love this one. It's definitely right up there with that. In the cheesiness and corniness factor is just right. It's not too much and it's not too little. I think it's right in there with those. So if you enjoy those, you'll probably like this book.
Now, moving on to the person who took over for John Gardner after he decided he was done writing Bond novels in the mid-late 90s, that would be Raymond Benson, and his first Bond novel was 0-10. Now, I love the premise of this book. In fact, this is going back to a discussion we had very recently when we were talking about the Pierce Brosnan film. I feel that the premise of 0-10 should have been the premise of Tomorrow Never Dies, because we're talking about the handover of Hong Kong from Britain to China.
Yes.
And that is something that James Bond absolutely had to be involved in, somehow.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Ultimate British Agent, one of the ultimate episodes of British intrigue in modern times. I mean, it just begged for it, especially if you're going to set a story in the Orient anyway. So I was kind of disappointed when Tomorrow Never Dies didn't go there. But this novel does, and it is Raymond Benson's first novel, not just first James Bond novel, first work of fiction, period. So that's something to keep in mind.
So now, you say first work of fiction. He had done nonfiction.
Yeah, he had
works
actually
before?
written the Ian Fleming companion.
Okay, I was going to ask, how was he invited to become a Bond author if he had no fiction background? But that explains.
Yeah, he was invited because he had been president of the basically James Bond. I'm blanking on the name. I apologize here, but he had been president of basically a James Bond society, and James Bond Bedside Companion was the title of the previous book. Again, Ian Fleming, James Bond. Sorry, messed that up. But basically, for
it's
his
the same thing, right?
No, it really isn't, and sorry about that. But he had been founded as someone who was very much into the James Bond universe, who knew James Bond backwards and forwards, and so this was a guy that they were perfectly willing to approach, even though he was an American.
What?
From Chicago.
Super American.
However, and he's then gone on to actually, he's been writing in other series after he did his work on James Bond. He's written for Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell series, and he has also written for video games. In fact, he's written for Hitman, both Damnation and he wrote book Damnation. He wrote Hitman Absolution. So he's done some
very
other
good
works.
things about those particular games, and specifically about the writing of the storyline of those games.
So he's done some good work since then. And 0-10 is actually a very good first novel, I think.
I did quite enjoy it, to be honest with you. I actually did really enjoy the book. There were some extreme contrivances, but again, I accept those in a James Bond novel. I mean, I thought he got around the world a little too quickly and too easily in some places. I mean, he was traveling, back and forth, jumping between Hong Kong and Australia a little too quickly and easily for my taste. It didn't seem it took him as much effort as it should have. But again, it's one of those things that in a Bond story, kind of expected and would almost miss it if it wasn't there.
You would, and as I'm reading this, to go with your theme from before, this one I think is a Dalton story. That's who fits best for me. My brain wanted to put Roger Moore in it, but Dalton is the one who definitely showed up.
And that's interesting because, as I had Dalton with the other one and you had Moore, I actually thought of Moore in this one. When I was reading this one, I thought of a younger Moore. I did think of him as definitely a very young Roger Moore, but I did think of Roger Moore in this particular one when I was reading it.
All right.
It's kind of interesting. We kind of flip-flop those two.
It is. Now, what I also found interesting as I was reading the book, for someone who is so rooted in James Bond lore as his major background, is that, and I suppose it is inevitable if someone's going to write about British Asia. I mentioned this in previous discussions that we've had, I think most recently about Skyfall.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's informed as he's writing this not just by Ian Fleming, the James Bond universe. By the way, he also keeps canon to John Garnder. In fact, he mentioned characters from Gardner's Bond universe as he talks about his Bond in this book. Okay. Like when he mentions Easy St. John and Flicka von Gruza, those are the steady girlfriends I mentioned.
Oh, okay. See, those were ones that, again, it's one of those things that when an author does it well, if you're not familiar with the references he's making, it's not distracting. However, if you are familiar with the references, you get it and you're like, oh yeah, okay, I know what you're talking about. And those were, I vaguely recall the names popping up, but it wasn't distracting to the story at the time, and of course I didn't know what he was referring to. I just assumed that it was either from past Fleming novels or past other novels, or that he was just creating backstory himself. It didn't bother me either way because I just kind of passed. I'm like, okay, whatever, and moved on. But yeah, if you know the backstory, that's when an author does it well. When they can reference back to something else in just the right way to where somebody who knows what they're referencing gets it, and someone who doesn't isn't distracted. So I think he did a really good job there.
I think he did. And he's informed not just by that, but also, I think if you've read the books, it's pretty obvious. There's some information by James Clavell in here, because I could picture stuff straight out of especially Taipan when I'm reading this book. Just the imagery, some of the character situations, some of the ways he refers to how Hong Kong society is put together as a social construct. It reminds me very, very much of James Clavell's approach to the same things, and the words he would use and the way that he would have a character introduced. So I think it's kind of a mix between the two. And it's a mix that works well, because James Clavell is very much Imperial British, so totally works.
Right.
I also like the way that even though he's accepting Gardner's canon, Bond is not quite so quick to fall in love anymore. It's definitely a pleasure thing, and when he feels like the other party wants to fall in love with him, he's got his distance going.
He gets the heck out of it. Yeah, I did notice that his approach to women was more what I expected from a Bond than what Gardner gave us for Special Services.
Yeah, I think that approach was much more realistic in this book. And again, even though the plot was very contrived, and in the end almost simplistic when you realize what it's going to happen, it still works. And even though anyone with half a brain has to have seen this red herring coming, and I think you know which one I'm talking about. Did you know who the ultimate bad guy was almost instantly?
I want to say yes. It was one of those ones where you kind of get that impression right away, and then you kind of vacillate a little bit, like, oh, maybe it's not him, but you never really get off of it. You never really get off of that sense. You know, right from the very beginning, you get the sense that, okay, he's covered. They're making too much of an effort to make this particular character seem like a slobbering idiot that is just a victim of circumstance, that most likely is going to be at least key at the end. Whether or not he's the ultimate villain or not, he's going to be key. And there's a couple of times when you almost think, okay, maybe he's not, but it never completely left the back of my mind that this one's in on it. This particular character is definitely in on it. So, yeah, this one did not surprise me very much. Not at all.
And I also thought that, I thought he handled them better, but big stinky red herrings are still big and key. Not nearly, because at least for Raymond Benson's approach, when he threw out the big stinky red herring, he just kind of threw it on the floor in the same room I'm sitting in, whereas John Gardner tried to shove it down my throat with an air. So overall, I think that this is a better book. And I was also much, much more willing to accept it as a pure James Bond book, as opposed to just some adventure book where somebody threw James Bond into it. Because even with the hybridization that I felt referencing Clavell and how he did things, it still felt at its heart always like a James Bond book. And that to me was very key to my enjoyment of 0-10.
Yes, I can definitely agree with that. I really did enjoy reading this book. I found it hard to put down when I had to go attend to other matters, so it was one of those ones that it did grab my attention right from the very beginning, and I did stay with it very easily, which is kind of one of the things I look at to determine whether or not a book is quote-unquote good, in my opinion. The literary content is kind of almost secondary to whether or not I physically enjoy reading it. If I have to force myself through something, I don't care how good a quality technically it may be, it's not going to be among my favorites. When a book is fun to read, that's when I really say this is a good book. And this is definitely one that I wouldn't say it's great, but I would qualify it as good.
Yeah, it's definitely not great, as you said, but like you said, I didn't want to put it down. Whereas Carte Blanche, I had to look at an excuse to pick it back up again, and that excuse always was, I don't quit on books. It's like, if I could read Parasites Like Us, just don't ever read that book. Just don't. I'm not even going to tell you about it. Just, if you ever see that title, run. It sucks. If I could read that book, then I could read Carte Blanche. Couldn't read Courtship of Princess Leia, but I could read Carte Blanche. Whereas I had no such trouble with 0-10. I read it in 3 sittings.
Yeah,
it was
really
hard to
an
put down
enjoyable
between
book.
those sittings.
Yeah, it really is an enjoyable book. It's not a hard read. It's not something that's going to make you think, where you have to be like sitting there like, oh, I need to go back over that last paragraph because I don't understand what happened. It's not like that. It's a fun, quick, easy read that will leave you happy that you did it at the end, which for me that's the epitome of a quality book right there. If you're happier at the end of having read it than you were before starting it, guess what? It was a good book. It's not one that I'd write home to mom about or anything crazy like that, but it definitely is a book that I would recommend, especially if somebody is interested in specifically getting into the Bond universe outside of Ian Fleming. I would definitely recommend this one.
In fact, I would actually recommend this the most highly of the 3 that we've discussed so far. In terms of it's a good book on its own merits without being a James Bond book, and it's a good James Bond book. And that, I think, to me, puts it head and shoulders above both the other ones, because in the case of Carte Blanche, I didn't like it either way. In the case of John Garnder, it's a good Bond book, but it's not really a good book otherwise. It's just a low, mediocre story, but hell, it's fun anyway.
Yes.
Whereas with this book, it's a good book, and it's a good Bond story, win on both counts, and I found this as a believable Bond. This is definitely an aging Bond.
Yes.
Not aged, but aging. So it's a more mature approach to Bond, but it works. So by all means, give 0-10 a try. I think you'll enjoy it. And I'm very, very glad that, at least in some way, James Bond did handle the handover of Hong Kong, because it was something that definitely needed to be done.
Yes, absolutely. I definitely agree with that. It's definitely something that the Bond universe should explore, and glad that they did it in such a way that was enjoyable.
Absolutely. So there you have it, 0-10. And now, of course, brings us to the moment you've all been waiting for, the most recent James Bond book. Because, of course, we could not have possibly done that one first. Because, that's only the one that most people are going to be curious about. We like to keep you in suspense, but we didn't throw red herrings your way.
There we go.
Most recent book, of course, is by William Boyd, and that is Solo. Now, what Boyd did is something different than the approach taken by the previous authors, because, of course, what John Garnder did is he kept the Ian Fleming canon, but just basically had Bond forget how to age for 20 years and put him in the 80s. Raymond Benson just had Bond keep right on going as a continuation of the Garnder universe, and Jeffery Deaver just rebooted Bond altogether. Now, in the case of William Boyd, who started off after, of course, being the most recent novel after all these people, he decided to ignore everybody else except for Ian Fleming.
Yes.
So what he did is he set his book 6 years after the events of The Man with the Golden Gun. Uh-huh. So basically what he's doing is he's keeping exactly to James Bond's biography as Ian Fleming wrote it, including the fake death notice from You Only Live Twice. So he's giving him the same birthday. And so what we have is James Bond just after he turns 45. And so this book takes place in the 60s. So what we're looking at is Bond hitting his just past midlife crisis, starting to feel a little bit old, but he's still all ready to go. He's still, a field agent and so on and so forth. So he gets involved in British intrigue in Africa.
Yes.
In, of course, the fake Republic of Fake Republic.
That's the Democratic Republic of Fake Republic. Thank you very much.
Oh, of course. Okay.
No, what do they call it? Zanzirim? Is that what it is?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we kind of get the feeling that it's somewhere in the neighborhood of Chad, Nigeria, that kind of general vicinity, that part of Africa. But
yeah, I definitely got a Nigeria feel when reading the book. I mean, there's so many different countries in Africa, and they're constantly changing. It would be nearly impossible to write a book like this and pick a real country, because by the time, 5 years from now when somebody read it, they're like, that's nothing like this country now, So
yeah,
making up a fake country is probably the safest course of action, I think, in this particular case.
Basically, if you're not picking either one of the North African countries that are right along the Mediterranean or South Africa, you're pretty much screwed.
Yeah. All the rest of those countries change names, hands, borders so often. It's like, why even bother drawing maps? They change by the time you finish drawing them one.
Yeah, so but we don't start with his mission in Africa, which I find interesting. Instead, we try to learn a little bit about James Bond as a human being. And so what he ends up is he ends up celebrating his birthday all alone in one of his favorite hotels, and he ends up meeting somebody and develops a casual flirtation with her. And this is the part that I especially love. Even though the studio is not identified, it basically has to be. She's a Hammer horror girl. How cool is that?
I did enjoy that. She was basically a B-movie actress, but top of the line B-movie actress. I mean, definitely top of the pile.
So to speak.
I wasn't trying to make that dirt. It's not my fault if it automatically is.
But so I actually like that as a choice of a casual girlfriend for Bond, someone who isn't part of any mission that he does and not part of his inner circle as a spy, but just someone he casually meets. I just think it's such a novel idea. It's just neat. It's cool. It works.
It is. I really enjoyed the fact, I was going to bring this up as a matter of fact, that I really enjoyed the fact that they brought in this female character that Bond interacts with who essentially isn't looking for anything more than Bond is. I mean, she's not really looking for a long-term relationship either. She's looking to have a little bit of fun with a guy that she just met. That's fine by her. And she doesn't end up being a major plot point. She doesn't end up being the bad guy or being kidnapped by the bad guy to move along the plot, or, you know, she's just...
Well, not quite, no, but sorry, go on.
I mean, he uses her, yes. I mean, he definitely, she helps him along, but she doesn't end up being, so core to the plot where you're like, so major to blah, blah, blah. It's nice to see an auxiliary character kind of stay fairly auxiliary, without it being, just the same old throughout the entire.
And though she doesn't quite match the description that was used, I couldn't help but picture Caroline Munro in the role. That, by the way, was Naomi from The Spy Who Loved Me. And the reason I could do that is because she was a Hammer girl herself. So that was easy for me to do. And my brain wanted to put in Daniel Craig.
Okay.
And I think he fits in terms of how the character plays.
Mm-hmm.
However, the reason that I couldn't do it is because they emphasize so much that he's in midlife. And even though Daniel Craig is the correct age for this character, he doesn't look that, because Daniel Craig looks younger than he is, which is why I had to put Roger Moore back in here.
Okay. Now, see, I went right with my initial gut feeling, and my initial gut feeling and it never changed. It never wavered the entire time I read this book. I pictured Daniel Craig in this role. I did picture the slightly older, more haggard version of Daniel Craig that we briefly saw in Skyfall, but I did picture Daniel Craig throughout this entire book.
And like I said, I can't fault you for it, because my brain wanted to do it. I wanted to read it in his voice. It's just every time they mentioned his age, it was like, all right, make him Roger Moore. So
now I think it's kind of interesting. We've gone through 4 different novels, 4 different authors, 4 different interpretations of Bond. And even though so many people think of Sean Connery as the Bond, none of our interpretations went back to Connery.
I'm not surprised we didn't go back to Lazenby, but
I'm almost surprised you didn't go to Lazenby with Carte Blanche, with how much you hated it. Like, I almost thought you just put Lazenby in that position to make yourself, despise it even more. I'm not surprised that none of us went to Lazenby for anything, quite frankly.
But I am kind of surprised. I was kind of waiting for you to go for Sean Connery somewhere. I wasn't quite sure where, maybe here, but I figured somewhere along the line you'd go with Connery. But I don't know why. I just did. And no, he's the one that we didn't mention out of anyone who would be.
I just thought it was, I kind of thought that you might go with Connery for special services. Like, that wasn't my impression, but that's kind of where I thought you might go with it. And so I was kind of shocked that neither one of us picked Connery for any of these 4 novels. So it'll be interesting to see, later on. I'm sure we'll do episodes that cover more novels, both Fleming and otherwise, later on. It'll be interesting to see who we picture throughout the different series, and I just think that's kind of funny that I'm like, so many people just immediately associate Connery with Bond, and yet with all 4 of these novels, and essentially we've got 8 different perspectives of Bond here, and none of them ended up being Connery.
Yeah, that's just, like you said, it's just interesting. Now, once we do get past the point of Bond meeting his Hammer girl,
yep.
I'm just going to keep calling her that.
It's fine by me.
we get on to, and you can interpret that however you want, ladies and gentlemen.
Bang, bang, bang. It's the sound a hammer makes. What?
We get to his being sent down to Africa because there's this Republic of Zanzirim, and there's a revolution going on, and the rebel faction, which seems to be being held together by this one great genius general who's holding off the entire British Army and the legitimate government and so on. And the only reason anyone really gives a crap is because they happen to be sitting on all of the newly discovered oil in the country. Yes. So we're fighting a war for oil. Gosh, we've never done this, ever.
I was going to say, this is the most plausible part of the entire plot, the fact that a war is being fought over oil. Nobody could possibly look at that and say, that's contrived. Nobody would ever do that. Because the fact of the matter is, it has happened over and over and over again. It's absolutely absurd to think of how many wars have really been fought over oil. So to think that one more could happen is not absurd whatsoever.
And so, of course, it also makes sense that Bond's mission as a 00 is to infiltrate the rebel stronghold and kill this famous general. So, okay, that part makes complete sense. In fact, everything that happens right up until he gets into rebel-held territory makes complete sense to me. I mean, it is dead-on plausible, but still feels like a Bond adventure.
Yes.
Then we get to the rebel encampment, and we start jumping shark.
No offense, Felix.
But not in a bad way. I
a very Bondy,
really enjoy this book.
A very Bond-like way.
Yeah, like he ends up having to help the rebels in a certain way, and he's undercover as a journalist at the time. They're saying, you're a journalist, how do you know so much? Well, he can actually give a plausible answer because we're keeping James Bond's original biography and therefore his age and his time, and he can say, you ever hear of something called World War II? Of course, any man his age would have been a very plausible World War II veteran. Mm-hmm. So it makes perfect sense that you would have somebody who's an ordinary journalist who happens to have some military knowledge because, hey, you fought in the biggest war in human history. All right, makes sense. All right. I can buy this.
Felix.
Yeah. Now, what seems odd is how very, very quick everything resolves there. It feels like the book should be over by the end of the second act. Now, of course, we have plot twist to give us a third act.
What a twist!
But like I said, sharks are jumped. It gets really kind of contrived, and the red herring they throw you in this case is not big and stinky. It's actually a decent red herring. And then they throw you another one. And in the end, what really happens feels very contrived. I'll admit that, but yes, it feels Fleming contrived. Out of all the books we've discussed, and in fact, even of the ones we haven't discussed that I've read, Boyd, I think, with Solo, captures the spirit of Ian Fleming's writing better than anybody else.
I could definitely agree with that. Of the ones that I've read, you know, like I said, I've only read the one Gardner novel. I've read the one Deaver novel because it's the only one. But especially of these four that we're talking about specifically, this one definitely seems the most Bondish. This one really resonated as a Bond novel. Yes, there are major contrivances, but they're Bond contrivances. They're not anything that you would think of as out of the ordinary for a Bond story. It fits and it works. Now, yes, near the end, there are a couple of things, specifically in how they let you, kind of how they leave it open for a sequel, so to speak. That gets a little bit extreme. I mean, the amount of damage that you see to one particular character, and then they somehow get up and walk away. What? You're like, no.
Yeah.
You're like,
to me, that
no.
struck me as completely ridiculous.
They did way too much description of how much was wrong with that person before then making them somehow get up and walk away on their own power. I'm like, no. You can't describe in that great a detail how badly that person was hurt and then have them somehow get away. That person has to be dead. You described in great detail their death. It wasn't just Bond saw the body go over a waterfall. He assumed he was dead, and then later, we never found the body. Okay, that I can get. This was like, he was destroyed.
Yeah, that's the one place where it doesn't just jump a shark, it jumps a megalodon.
Yeah, you're
and
like,
I don't mean the really shitty computer graphics megalodon from the Discovery Channel. I mean,
he jumped Sharktopus at that point. He jumped Sharktopus right there. Damn you, Sharktopus!
But he jumped him in an Ian Fleming way.
He did. He really did. I mean, really, they left it open without, like you mentioned with Carte Blanche. he left it open for additional storylines without making it absolutely necessary. With Carte Blanche, he almost like made it like this was part one. It was almost like you could see to be continued written on the last page. Whereas with this one, he left it hanging there like, hey, we could, if we wanted to, bring this particular character back in a future story. We don't have to. You know, it's there. If we want to use it, we can. If we don't have to. Whereas with Carte Blanche, like you said, it was almost written as if it was part one of a trilogy or more without any promise of future novel.
Yeah, it's not a contrived subplot that has nothing to do with the rest of the story that's woven in as an arc piece. It's something that flows out of this story. Right. It's out of the major plot of this story, and it can flow into another book, or it can flow dead into the ocean.
Exactly.
Either way, it doesn't feel forced. I mean, the fact that this character is walking feels forced, but it doesn't feel forced that he's walking specifically into a sequel.
Right.
It's just more of, if anything, it's more of a matter of reminding Bond that he still has to be Bond.
Yes. He doesn't get to let up. He doesn't get to quit. He's got to be on lookout. But, you know, I would be okay with if they did do a quote-unquote sequel, you know, if Boyd comes back for another novel, which I hope he does, because this one was good, and I would definitely like to see more by him. Whether or not he brings back elements from this story or not, or whether or not it's completely new. Either way, I liked this book, and in fact, it made me want to check out more of William Boyd's work as well, what he's done. Because I've never read, as far as I know, I've never read anything by William Boyd outside of this, so...
Yeah, nor I. But I would very much like to see another William Boyd James Bond novel.
Yes.
I'll be honest, just because the shark that was jumped is so huge, I would be happier if you don't revisit that part. However, I wouldn't be necessarily opposed if we do. But I definitely do want to see more from William Boyd in the James Bond universe, because I do think he did an excellent job.
Yes.
And I'm kind of afraid that if we don't have William Boyd come back, then we'll have had 3 one-offs in a row going on a 4th, and that's just showing, okay, it'll be setting a trend that gives off bad vibes. That's just saying maybe this thing needs to die.
Yeah.
And I'll admit, after Jeffery Deaver, I was ready for it to die. It's kind of like the experience of Die Another Day, moving on to Casino Royale. After Jeffery Deaver, I would have been ready for the series to go. But when you had a much higher quality piece of work come after it in the form of Solo by William Boyd, I think we're ready to start fresh, and I like the way that it's been done.
Yes.
And ironically, in this case, they did it by going back to the beginning rather than starting fresh.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I would definitely love to see more from William Boyd. I would prefer if they don't come back to characters from this book, other than Bond, of course. But if they did, I wouldn't be necessarily upset by that either. You know, it's kind of like one of those things that, yeah, I could see it, because they've already made the contrivance that's necessary, so they wouldn't have to make any additional contrivances to make it work. They've already done what they needed to do to set that up, so I wouldn't be upset by it. I would prefer, I think he has the capability. I think this author has the capacity to do something brand new. So I would prefer to see that, personally. But then again, he could write something absolutely brilliant using the same character that we saw in Solo. So, you know what? Either way, I'm looking forward to seeing what there is still to come in the Bond universe, in the novels. And hopefully William Boyd will be a part of that, at least for 1 or 2 more, I'm hoping.
I agree. I think that after a long time of being on shaky ground, I think with Solo, we finally hit a stride. I'm not saying that it's a perfect book, because again, it's pretty contrived once you start getting into the rebel-held territory. And after a while, it starts even to feel a little thin. But it's consistent with Ian Fleming's style. It's consistent with his character. And even when the story gets too contrived and maybe too thin, the character is strong enough to keep it going.
Yes.
It's basically, when I read this book, it was like reading Ian Fleming without the racism and the misogyny.
Exactly. It had the quality of the work without the downsides that we got from Ian Fleming's personality that we didn't like. You know, the parts that we didn't enjoy about Ian Fleming's personality that came through in his works, we didn't see that. My only concern with William Boyd continuing, and just taking a look at his other work, he seems to be an expert on Africa. He really does most of his novels previously have been set in Africa, which is great. That's fantastic that you have a speciality. It's fantastic that you know something
from what
well
I understand,
enough.
that's also where he grew up.
Yeah,
so
that makes sense. However, Bond travel. Bond has to be all over the place. If we see another Bond set in the same place, it's going to get boring. We don't want to see Bond in the same place all the time. So that would be my only concern with future novels coming from William Boyd. I hope that he knows other areas well enough to write Bond in them, that it doesn't have to be another story of Bond set in Africa.
I don't think we have to worry so much, just because if you really look at it, you've only got the second act being set in Africa. I mean, yes, the whole thing is centric around this Africa plot, but the first act is primarily in Britain. Third act is primarily the United States.
Yes.
So I think that I've got a good feeling that this will be okay.
Yeah, I don't think
we have to worry about that.
It's going to be a problem. I think he can pull it off. That would be, like I said, I'm really kind of grasping at straws to think of my only possible concern. Like, I'm really looking forward to him possibly writing more novels. I don't know if there is any, I don't know if he's already been contracted. I don't know if he's already, at this point, we haven't heard anything as far as I know as to any
nothing that
definitive
I know of
plan. But I hope that the next Bond novel is by William Boyd, and I hope that it circumvents any concerns I might have about the contrivances of this book and about the setting. And I think that he can pull it off. Quite frankly, I have fairly high hopes without getting too pumped up about my own expectations so that I be let down. But I think we have a reasonable expectation of a good next book if William Boyd does. Now,
I agree. And I don't think it's the recency factor either, especially since out of the books that we've discussed, I read this one, I read this one the least recently. Because even though I'd read the other three before, I reread them for this. So
Gotcha.
Solo was the one I read first. I read it right after it came out.
Gotcha. Now I've got a question for you. Now that we're done talking about the books that we have read, this has been kind of pressing on my mind, and I'm curious as to how you would answer this. If you could pick any author, living or dead, who has not previously written any James Bond novel to write a James Bond novel, who would you pick?
Wow. I'm going to take a second to think about this. Since you thought of the question, I'm assuming you have an answer.
You are assuming incorrect. No, that's the thing is I thought about the question. I was like, that'll be a good question. Now, who would I pick? If I went with living, it's a tough call, but I think I would go with Michael Connelly.
And why would you do that?
Because he has proven throughout his various novels that he can write one character very well and keep that character in character throughout multiple novels, but he also has the capability of writing many different characters. So he's not stuck in just one character that's always the same no matter what his name is. He's proven to me through my reading that he can write a bunch of different characters, but also that he has the capability of keeping a particular character, the same as what he should be. So I think he could take a character like James Bond and write him correctly. And plus, I love his storyline. He's a very good mystery writer. I've always enjoyed all of his books, the Hieronymus Bosch series specifically. I've absolutely loved. So I think that Connelly could probably put out a good mystery-style Bond novel. And I would like to see that. As far as, going to living or dead, that's a real tough one because there's so many great authors to pick from. And there's so many that don't even write in that genre that I'd love to see if they could. I'd love to see someone like Anne McCaffrey's take on Bond. Wouldn't that just be the weirdest thing to think of?
That would be kind of cool.
Yeah, I could just imagine it. I'm like, that would be so awesome. Or Piers Anthony, who I'm not 100% sure if he's still living. I know he's not writing anymore, but I'm pretty sure he's passed on. I'd probably have to look it up. But somebody like that who's proven they can write sci-fi and fantasy extremely well. I'd like to see their take on an action-adventure spy thriller, especially in the Bond universe. So that's kind of how I would lean with that. What about you? Have you thought of anything?
I have, and in fact, I'm practically slapping my forehead because I've been answering the question for myself almost the entire time we've been talking. As far as dead, even though one thing you would be absolutely guaranteed of is the novel will be 1,000 pages long.
Okay.
Will be James Clavell.
Okay.
just because he is another one of those characters, another one of those authors who is ultimately a British Empire author. And I think he could really speak to the Britishness of James Bond and really get into the aspect of him as being an agent of Queen and Country.
Right.
And his descriptions and his adventures that he writes about are just amazingly richly detailed. I mean, it's a different kind of detail porn than you get from Tom Clancy and so on. This is much more of a social detail porn. This is world building. And I think that it would be very interesting to see his take on 007. So that would be as far as a dead author.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but James Clavell that you're speaking of, he wrote the novels that inspired Shogun, correct?
He wrote Shogun.
Okay. Oh, he actually wrote the TV, the miniseries?
No, as in the book that it's based on.
Okay. That's what I was like. Did he write the series as well, or just the book that it was?
No, he wrote the books that. There have been miniseries made of a few of his books.
Right.
In order, they're called the Asian Saga. He wrote Shogun, Gaijin, and then Taipan, and then King Rat, and Noble House, and then Whirlwind.
Okay. Yeah, like,
and actually, I got
the name just kind of popped into my head. I'm like, I know that, and I remember the miniseries. I've never read the novel, but I did watch the miniseries several times. Actually, that was one of my parents' favorites, so I watched it several times with them, and it was extremely entertaining. So if he had anything to do with that, then definitely I could see him writing a Bond novel.
And quick apology, I mixed up the order of Taipan and Gaijin. Taipan comes first, then Gaijin.
Yeah, rookie. No, I'm just kidding. I got no clue.
But as far as a living author, along the same vein that you mentioned, someone who I'd be interested to see what his style could do with it, and this is just off the wall, out of left field, would be K.W. Jeter. He's actually the author who coined the term steampunk.
Okay.
When he was describing his novel Infernal Devices. He's famous to many people as the person who wrote a couple of literary sequels to Blade Runner. He wrote a fabulous novel called Noir, which is definitely worth checking out. So I'd be interested to see what he would do with it.
The name sounds familiar. Has he ever done any of the Star Wars novelizations or Star Trek novelizations?
He has done Star Trek.
Okay, because the name sounds familiar, but not from what you're talking about. Because I've never been a huge, here's my thing with steampunk. I love the look of it. I've never really been that intrigued by the story of it in what I've read thus far. Now, it may just be that what I've read thus far has only really been a few comic books that featured it, and it was just kind of like, meh. But I like the look of it. I love the look of steampunk stuff, especially when you take steampunk and crossed with other things. Like I've seen some really cool steampunk Star Wars stuff, like steampunk Darth Vader, steampunk Stormtrooper, things like that, where it's like, yeah, that looks cool. But as far as the story, I've never really gotten into it. But again, it's been a very limited sample. So are you saying that if I were to check out K.W. Jeter stuff specifically, that I might change my tune on that?
I think it's definitely worth your time to check out. As I said, he's one of the fathers of the genre, and he is the father of the term.
Okay. And you know what? I just pulled him up here on Wikipedia, found it, and sure enough, he did write 3 Star Wars novels that were written in 1999 or before, so that definitely means I have read them. And I'll have to take a look at the synopsis to see if I'm remembering them correctly, but he's credited for The Mandalorian Armor, Slave Ship, and Hard Merchandise, which means he probably focused on Boba Fett and kind.
Trilogy. Yeah.
Yes, which I recall being very good. I really enjoyed those. Pretty much any. I mean,
they're about 10 feet away from me, next to my liquor cabinet.
I'll admit, I was kind of a sucker for any of the Boba Fett stories written afterwards, because they did such a great job taking that character so far beyond what George Lucas did with him. I mean, he always had he was that character in the movies that had the potential to be so awesome, but never really mattered too much in the movies. If you really look at just the movies, the character was kind of like he was a whiny bounty hunter who's like, oh, I want my money, damn it. And then he got knocked into the Sarlacc pit. It's like, okay, he's done. But then in the novels,
so much more awesome at EU.
Exactly. In the expanded universe, he is a phenomenal character. They've written him so well. And if I recall correctly, these books, I'll have to do a little bit of research to verify if these are the ones I'm thinking of. But I remember specifically a couple of different trilogies of the Star Wars books that I really attached myself to, and I know that one of those was the Timothy Zahn trilogy, the Thrawn trilogy, which if you haven't read those, they're fantastic. Absolutely.
They are.
Amazing.
And Timothy Zahn himself is also a really wonderful guy. I had a chance to hang out with him for a couple of hours once.
Really?
And that was very, very cool experience.
Wow, that's awesome. He was actually at the last Phoenix Comic-Con. He was at 2013's Comic-Con. I did not get a chance to meet or see him, but he was there. But that's awesome that you had a chance to hang out with him. No, I definitely enjoy his work quite a bit, especially those Star Wars. But yeah, I'm going to have to check that out. Taking a look here at his other credits, he does have a couple of Deep Space Nine, specifically Star Trek novels, which I know I have not read because I have not read any Deep Space Nine novelization. And not because I don't like Deep Space Nine, just because I just haven't. I just haven't grabbed those. But yeah, taking a quick look at the listing of works, I'm definitely going to have to check out some of these.
Definitely worth your time. And I'm going to throw one more your way. Now, this isn't steampunk. This is something totally different.
Okay.
And this isn't somebody who I'm saying to write a standard James Bond novel.
Okay.
But the reason I'm tossing this out there is because he has written a series of books that takes off on the theme of James Bond, where the lead character is a Bond-like character in a completely different type of universe. Author's name is Charles Stross, and he is, to me, one of the finest science fiction writers currently out there. His work is phenomenal. Former IT guy turned writer. And one of his series is known as The Laundry Files. And it's based on the notion of kind of a combination of espionage thriller meets Cthulhu.
Okay.
And
go on.
His lead character is part of this secret British government agency, which is codenamed The Laundry. And it's based on trying to keep these evil demonic forces out of the world and dealing with them when they show up. And one of the ways that it turns out that these things get called up is, and this is to me just one of the most awesome premises ever. If you think about the idea of magic, what do you have to do for magic to work? You have to come up with a very specific set of incantations read exactly right in order to produce your desired result.
Okay.
That's a magic spell. How does a computer program work? You have to write exact instructions written in a very specific order, said properly, in order for your program to work.
Yum.
What if you could accidentally write a computer program that called up demons?
Oops.
That is how our main character, our Bond analog, gets involved in this. And it's just very, very cool set of books. Starts off with a book called The Atrocity Archives, and it goes on from there. Highly recommend these works by Charles
Stross.
Yep. So if you love James Bond and you love science fiction and fantasy horror, and combine all our loves here together, read those books. But in the meantime, now that we've given you plenty to read or ask for under the tree, being that it is the holiday season as we record this.
Oh, yes, of course. And if you are going to purchase any of these books online, I highly encourage you to visit our website at sociallyawkwardstudios.com. Click on the Amazon.com banner. Then shop as normal. You can find all sorts of books, audio books, e-books, anything you could possibly buy from Amazon. It will not cost you a single penny more than if you went to Amazon.com directly, but you will help out the 4i Radio Network. You will help us bring you all these free programs that we bring you every day of the week, every day of the year. And it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't cost you a single penny more than if you just went to Amazon.com and bought it normally. So do that. Go to either sociallyawkwardstudios.com or the Sasquatch.net and click on that Amazon banner. Then just shop as normal, and it helps us out. So do that, please.
Yeah, and maybe by the next time we record a show, Eric will have put that link on the Her Majesty's pod page too.
That sounds like a good idea. That sounds like a really fantastic idea. I really should do that, shouldn't I? I should probably put it on all of the network pages that I have control over, which is quite a lot of them, actually.
Including for our friend, one more shout out to our friend Matt Renfro, who helped us out with his picks for our last show about music.
Yes.
Listen to the Fro Show. Check out some new indie music through that. And lots of other shows on the Fern. By all means, check out the 4i Radio website. But in the meantime, that's going to about do it for our discussion of James Bond and literature. Join us next time as we do another little riff on the holiday theme for the time of year. We're going to talk about James Bond's toys.
The fun stuff.
So the gadgets and the cars of 007 and maybe some of the people surrounding him. So you have that to look forward to next time. Meanwhile, we're really glad you hung out with us here at Her Majesty's Secret Podcast. I'm Ziggy Berkeley.
And I'm Eric Dewey.
And we'll catch you next time on Her Majesty's Secret Podcast, only on The Fern.
Hi, this is Jeff from the 12A Podcast. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this show, please make sure to check out more on 4eyeradio.com.